Y'all ready? Say yeah! Say yeah! Say yeah! We're a winner, and never let anybody say that you can't make it. 'Cause a feeble mind is in your way. No more tears will we cry, and we have finally dried our eyes, and we're moving on up. Moving on up. Lord have mercy, we're moving on.
Hello and welcome to Shaping Young Minds. Today we are honoring Martin Luther King Jr. Our panelists for today are Karen V. Calhoun, womanist, theologian, and educator; LaRoma White, attorney at law, professor of criminal justice and educator; Norman Montgomery of Neighborhood Development Services, and his title is executive director; Monice Adams, activist, educator, and president of New Era Foundation Organization; and finally, our attorney, Lew Meyers.
Hello and welcome again to Shaping Young Minds. I am one of your hosts. My name is China Smith and I am 15 years old. I would like to be a musician or a lawyer.
Hello, my name is Cherry Solomon. I'm 22 years old and I am majoring in business management.
Hello, my name is Chardanay Smith. I'm 12 years old, and I would like to be an artist someday.
Martin Luther King Jr. was born January 15, 1929. He will be 88 years old. We are honoring his life this month.
His father, a pastor, was Martin Luther King Sr. His mother was Alberta Williams King.
He had an older sister, Christine, and a younger brother, Alfred Daniel Williams.
Dr. King was a gifted student. He was admitted into Morehouse College at the age of 15.
He did not originally intend on being a minister. He was mentored and influenced by Dr. Benjamin Mays, who was strong on racial equality.
He graduated in 1948, and he entered Crozer, the theological seminary. He earned his Bachelor of Divinity degree.
He won a prestigious fellowship and was elected president of his mostly white senior class.
He enrolled in a graduate program at Boston University, completing in 1953. Then 2 years later, his doctorate degree.
While in Boston, he met a young singer who was studying at the New England Conservatory in Music.
Martin and Coretta married in 1953 and settled in Montgomery, Alabama.
Dr. King became pastor of Dexter Baptist Church. They had 4 children: Yolanda Denise King, Martin Luther King III, Dexter Scott King, and Bernice Albertine King.
So now we will ask the panelists to take us further. Please tell us about the Montgomery bus boycott.
The boycott. Well, when the boycott happened, I was a little girl. so I can't really speak on it from a personal perspective, only from the perspective of how it changed the country, how it, the fact that it was placed on television. And we lived in Chicago at the time, so we weren't there. And that's one of the things about history, you know, if you're not somewhere, living somewhere, you don't know what people are really going through. So we saw this on television, and so therefore, we benefited from what people were doing in Montgomery.
I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. So I was in St. Louis, and I was a child also at the time of the Montgomery boycott. And at that time, we didn't have fancy color televisions. We had a little small black and white screen. But to see the boycott on television was just amazing to me. And it made me more aware. I mean, I saw racism as I was growing up, but seeing the boycott on television highly impacted me.
The Montgomery bus boycott was one of the things I looked at in terms of tactics and strategy for civil disobedience, even as we move forward today. Martin Luther King, when he became pastor of Dexter, also became president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And it was within the Montgomery Improvement Association that he actually led the boycott of the buses from his nonprofit, not necessarily from the pulpit. But it was a case where, and this began with Rosa Parks. I mean, we cannot leave out the fact that Rosa Parks refused to give up the seat, which spurred Martin to begin the tactics of the boycott. And he was arrested for it. He was convicted of it. Birmingham had an anti-boycott law. Sometimes I think they passed it just for him. But he was convicted, and I will say this, the judge seemed to stay it on appeal, but I am not really that familiar with the exact details of the case, but it was very prominent at the time.
I wasn't born then, but growing up and going to school and hearing about it was very awesome to hear about it. But I know as I go and I ride the bus, I know I can sit anywhere that I want.
The moment of the Montgomery boycott, just a few facts. We can give Dr. King only part of the credit. The boycott was started by E.D. Nixon, who worked with the NAACP. He had been a leader for a number of years. He was a Pullman car porter.
Yes.
And Rosa Parks, the lady who had volunteered, to sit on the bus and not get up, had been a member of the NAACP. What's important to note is that Rosa Parks was not the first person to sit in the front of the bus and to be arrested. But it was a calculated political decision made by the leadership, including E.D. Nixon at the time, that they wanted somebody that if they got arrested, they had no prior background and, they were clean. E.D. Nixon, Rosa Parks, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, which is, by the way, right across from the state capitol. I've been there, in Alabama, in Montgomery. Now, Dr. King ultimately was convicted not of a crime per se when the boycott was going on. That was another conviction, but that kind of unfolds with something else. But people should know Montgomery, E.D. Nixon, Rosa Parks, Dr. King, and later, Dr. King's ally, Rev Karen.
Yes. Tactics and strategies.
Question, so what were the conditions like for black people in the early 50s?
Nobody wants to take that. First of all, America was a system of racial apartheid. The nation was. And apartheid, can be considered to be, can be seen in the context of segregation. America was black, America was white. I remember as a young man, there were, if you wanted to get some water in any public facility, there was a water fountain for colors, there was a water fountain for whites. If you wanted to go into the restroom, and I had this experience in Jackson, Mississippi when I was 15. I went into a white restroom because I didn't read the signs right. But there were restrooms for whites, there were restrooms for blacks. The schools were absolutely segregated. Black students could not go to school with white students. I mean, they were racially segregated. And then later on, we're going to get into James Hood, we're going to get into James Meredith. All that flows from this period of time.
Yes, it does.
Well, I'd just like to say I was born in '54. So it's like the blessing is to be born at a time when these things begin to open up, you know, because it was real. And then living in Chicago was different than living in Mississippi. I mean, it was bad, it was segregated, but it wasn't the same kind. It was the kind you couldn't see. We had the invisible lines.
Separate but equal was the theme of the times at that time. I was a child, probably about in the 50s, about 6 years old, 6 or 7. I didn't know or understand anything about racism at that time, but I learned very quickly. Even though I went to predominantly black schools, I had white teachers who definitely did not mind showing their racist side. So we kind of dealt with it, separate but equal, even though that was not really the case. We really were not equal.
What you have to understand about the time was that most of what you consider now was actually encoded in some form or fashion into law or was held as an unwritten law. In Chicago itself, through 1947, you had the racially restricted covenants, which did not allow black people to move into certain neighborhoods. As we progress in Dr. King's history, he came to Chicago and proclaimed Chicago to be one of the most racist places he had ever been. Racism is not necessarily abject violence against you. Sometimes it can be invisible violence. It can be what you're denied or what's not permitted. A lot of times it can be how you're interpreted. So there are a number of considerations. It's almost insidious because you can't afford to be distracted from your path, but you cannot ignore what you're going to face.
1954 is important, Karen, and let me tell you why. On May 17th, 1954, in America, segregation supposedly was dismantled. The United States Supreme Court, in the case of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. And now let me make it relevant to the students here. That was 1 year before the Montgomery bus boycott.
Yes.
You know, school segregation was found to be unconstitutional in 1954, even though I still was going to a black high school in 1965. I had never seen a white, Randy, I had never seen a white faculty member. In fact, I had never seen any white people come through my school unless the police was chasing some of us around the campus. You know, so at the end of the day, you know, America, even today, they're still chasing us around Chicago. I mean, things really have not changed. 1954 was Brown versus Board of Education. 1955, you know, E.D. Nixon, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church made a major change in the history of the world.
Yes, they did.
And I'd like to add also Emmett Till.
Emmett Till, that was 1955.
Yes.
And I happen to have known his mother. You know, I was not in Chicago, and by the way, I was a civil rights lawyer in Mississippi, but I was born and raised in Houston, Texas. So I was born and raised in the South. But of course, Emmett Till, that was a spark.
Yes.
You know, when they showed his body, Jet Magazine published that. And when they showed that, it reviled the world. And it was a major turning point. But getting back to the point, Dr. King was the avatar. He was the inspiration because the civil rights movement, starting in 55 in Montgomery, right? He became a symbol. He became a spokesperson. He became an inspiration for African Americans who saw themselves in him, and he saw themselves in them.
I'd also like to say, and I love the name Avatar for him. What I learned as I went on in my educational life, that as important as he was to us, he was amazingly important to other people, especially other minorities. I mean, and women. What he did, he opened the world up for everybody. And oftentimes we kind of embrace him as our own, but the power of Dr. King among other minorities is, or Europeans, people who are not being treated, who want civil rights, basic human rights. The first person they're going to think about is Dr. Martin Luther King.
So what started the movement?
Slavery. You know, I think people have been historically inaccurate. They think the movement started in 1955. That's an insult to anybody, particularly any historian. It started when we got off of the boat. You know, we more than 100 million black people doing what is called a Middle Passage was brought from Africa to the shores of America, in Brazil, in Jamaica, in Grenada, all over the world. So the movement started, the movement for human dignity and human liberation started when they took us, when they took our mothers and our fathers and our grandmothers and our grandfathers from Africa, transported us here as less than human beings, placed us on this planet, put a label on us as Africans, right? And a label on us, I won't call the other name, but at the end of the day, it started when we got here, not in 1954. 54 was an incident. Bringing me from Africa was the cause.
Oh, yeah.
I kind of like to think that that's the point of no return, the catalyst. That's when
That's
the
right.
bubble broke. If you look at the history of the treatment, you will find that even in Chicago's own history, the returning veterans from World War I and the riots down on 31st Street, the issues down in Louisiana with the troops as they were coming in and out, particularly the black troops, going over to Europe and actually seeing a different set of white people, if you'll pardon the expression, and how they were treated differently by their own people. I mean, maybe it takes a number of things to come together and catalyze a movement, but it just didn't start overnight. I mean, it just wasn't something that came up. I mean, it was bubbling and gurgling, and then all of a sudden it reached a point when they said it had to stop. And quite properly, that's where the meetings at the Dexter Church, that's where the creation of the Improvement Association, that's where SCLC, or should I say Ralph Abernathy and Dr. King and Mr. Nixon, who was also a Confederate of A. Philip Randolph, who was very prominent in later movements in terms of black history and black rights. But I mean, nothing is a stop.
I'm probably the only one here. And I had the privilege to see Dr. King in February of '68, 2 months before he died. I was with him in Washington, D.C. Now, I look like I'm a young man, don't I, Karen? But anyway, I was around. I was a student at Howard University, and I had the opportunity to hear Dr. King speak. Not too far from my campus. I went that night. I'll never forget it. I will never forget it. I also saw him in '67. But let me tell you what was unique about him. I was a fan of Dr. King most of his time, and sometimes I wasn't. I didn't think he was militant enough. But let me tell you when he changed the world, when the world had to look at him. It was 1967 in April at the Riverside Baptist Church. He gave a speech, Why I Oppose the Vietnam War. That speech set him different in the world. The world looked at it because he understood the oppression and the violence in Vietnam. He understood, he even mentions in his speech on April 4th, 1968, South Africa. Prior to that time, well, between 1955 and 1962, Dr. King never recognized that there was a connection between what was happening on the struggle in South Africa with what was happening in Birmingham and in Montgomery. But he had grown, and I admire him and I love him today because he had the courage, he had the temerity to speak out not just about us, but he was a man, a person of the world. And don't ever forget that. Dr. King took himself above and beyond, the ghetto. He went into the bowels of the world and made a difference in human life.
I too have to. I love him. I fell in love with him in 1980. I was working for DePaul University, and a graduate student did their thesis on King, and this is prior to Eyes on the Prize. Eyes on the Prize opened him up to opened him up to more people, but it amazed. He was so young and so beautiful. He and his wife. It's like these people were kids. He had this great big hat on. He just looked like this young boy. But the more you live, the more you understand people like him, because also his footsteps are ongoing. I believe that it never stops. I think the movements are always happening. People are always doing something, but we have to find out where and who.
I think his lasting legacy was the one of nonviolence. It would have been quite easy during Bloody Sunday or any one of a number of other times when the violence was getting out of hand to have responded violence to violence. I mean, right now you can see it in the tension in the streets currently as to how literally standing face to face you have protesters and you have police, and it's like everybody wants to taunt the other person. What he brought to the scene was the passion of nonviolence, the passion of standing up in somebody's face in your belief, not in your strength. Make your strength and your love, make that what motivates you. And it was literally a futile cause to use violence against them.
Absolutely.
It became the issue that the world rose up against because they watched them sick the dogs on the kids. They watched them, you turn the hoses on the kids. And she's right. What I remember, I was born in 1953. And what I remember about 1958 and 59, well, there were little faces like mine out in those crowds. And when you see people start to beat on other people, the first thing you do is fear. But that's kind of what the whole battle was about. It's, it's something you can't succumb to, and that's kind of what he lifted us over.
I am so proud to be on the panel with these young folk. My sister next to me said she was 12 years old. I think one of you said you were 15 and 16. I want you to know that I got into the civil rights movement at the age of 15. At the age of 15, I was the NAACP Youth Council leader in the city of Houston. And I led the first movements in the city to desegregate, to integrate the school system. I was 15 years old. And I'm proud to know that you all are here because your role is important. The movement, as we refer to it, was led by young folk.
Yeah.
Of course, there were elders and old folk, but at the end of the day, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality, and a number of civil rights organizations were primarily predicated on young folk taking up the mantle to fight. And I want to encourage you. I'm going to say that you should be on the front of every struggle in terms of achieving your dignity and your rights as human beings. And so keep on doing what you're doing. If I can do it at 15, you can do it at 12. And if I can make a difference. I went from being the NAACP Youth Council president at 15 until in 1993, I became the chief operating officer of the national NAACP in Baltimore. I went from being a kid all the way to the chief operating officer of the national organization.
It all begins when you're kids. When as you were saying, when I was 13 years old, I lived in Gary. I was a member of the NAACP Youth Council when they were electing Richard Hatcher. That was when we began our little drive and came out to try and get politically active. It was always the youth that led the movements. They may not have directed it. They didn't have the experience, but we were the beneficiaries. I mean, our parents weren't going to be there. Martin wasn't going to be there when we got to the mountaintop, but hopefully you would. Hopefully you would be the ones that had the benefit of the struggle that we had gone through. And it keeps coming just in that fashion.
So the torch has been passed now to you guys, okay? And I wasn't aware, because I was a protected young black girl in St. Louis, Missouri, which was not nearly as progressive as Chicago during that time in history. However, I became aware, and I began to think more about the nonviolent movement that Dr. King promulgated at that time. And I knew, I mean, you know when things are not right, you feel it, you know. And what it did to me was it sparked my interest and made me want to know more. I didn't wait for somebody to educate me about it. I started reading some books and educating myself, okay?
Right.
So here you are.
It's always good to research and investigate, because we will always need civil rights.
I've heard it said at the panel, that he was a man of the world. To find him in other people, because he's there. He studied under Mahatma Gandhi.
And now we're back with more Shaping Young Minds and our host and our esteemed panel.
Do we still need civil rights today?
More than ever.
Yes, we do.
When you look at what the movement in the 60s, and then the 70s, and then move into what's going on now, we're in a different time and a different era, but nothing's changed. So it's like the movement it has to be alive and well.
I have a question.
No, you know, let me say something to you as young folk. That was a major change in my life. You know, I used to admire Malcolm X. And Malcolm X, back in around 1963, went overseas and met with Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt. And I remember when Malcolm came back, he started saying, this is not a civil rights movement, it's a human rights movement. And he was the first person that I ever heard to make that distinction. And I was a young man then, and I didn't quite catch it. But now he was brilliant when he said it, because this is, no, we don't just need civil rights, we need human rights. Civil rights are the rights that you acquire as a citizen within a sovereign. If you are a citizen of the United States, you are a civil citizen, you have civil rights. I am, young people, a citizen of the world. And so I cannot be limited by Chicago. I cannot be limited by saying I am a citizen of the United States. This is the era of global diplomacy. This is the era of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that says I am who I am, not because of the U.S. Constitution, but because as a citizen of the world, I have certain natural rights that gives me the right to be a human being wherever I am, whatever planet I might be on. So I'm not talking civil rights no more. Since 1963, I've been talking human rights, and it demeans me to have anybody think that I am not a human rights person, and that the only fight in the world is civil rights. Dr. King understood that in 1968 when he made the move to say, look, this war in Vietnam and what is going on, the apartheid in South Africa, that's all of us, and we are a part of that. And we are not limited by jurisdiction. Whether you're in Birmingham or Johannesburg, you are a citizen of the world.
As a primary school teacher, I find that teaching democracy and teaching the Constitution to the children, because they missed a lot of that. They missed what we know as natural, because we came up from families and people who were fighting for civil rights. But the children I serve are entitled. They don't even know that there was a struggle. They don't know it was a fight. They don't really understand anything about Dr. King and what happened. They don't know anything about invisible lines. They have grown up in a world where you get free lunch, you get free breakfast, you know, and so being a member of the National Alliance for the Empowerment of Formerly Incarcerated Citizens, I see that once someone goes to jail, their rights are taken away. You know, their rights for housing, rights for student aid, anything, you know, just, and other people come and take their place. So it feels like we do need civil rights again, or at least it needs to be taught.
I'm shocked.
Well, I was gonna say, being a young woman, an African American young woman, a black young woman, I didn't grow up in, like, you know, a nice neighborhood. I grew up in a neighborhood where it's poverty. A lot of our young men and women settle for jail, or they settle for, you know, what is handed to them, you know, the free lunch. They don't want the real education. They want, you know, the easy way out. And I think that was like what you were saying, when you like, we don't know that this, you know, that we're entitled to it, you know, that it's like we're supposed to have this, like we should want it, but a lot of us don't.
All I know is that all of this begins with inalienable human rights. Inalienable human rights, as the lawyer said, are the basis of where everything else starts from. Call it civil rights, call it legal rights, all of those are, as he expressed, conditions of a sovereign or of a government. Otherwise, it's the inalienable rights granted you by God. And that's where it begins. And someone had to take that away in order for you to lose it. And that's what we fight against. The loss of that. You were born with it. You don't have to ask for it. You don't have to wonder where it went. It should be there for you. Now, you do have to put forth some effort to manage it, to grasp it, to mold it and shape it into what you want. But it's not a question of you not having it. So I'd like to say that you begin with inalienable human rights, and from there you build on what's going on.
But I think what you said is very important. We were poor in 1956. By the way, we were poor in 1966. And we were poor in the ghetto was there. I was raised in the ghetto. And things ain't come full circle yet. Right. The South Side here was what we call Fifth Ward in Houston, Texas. That was the ghetto. That's where I came up. And what young people see today, while they may not have known the story of Dr. King, they know and you know the story of pain. When you come up on the South or the West Side, and in 2014, the Chicago Police Department stopped 250,000 of young African-American men in less than an 8-month period of time, didn't arrest them, harassed them, right? You know, no probable cause, no reasonable suspicion. The racism is very much alive. So the young folk who look out today and they become gang members, and the young folk who look out today and they become drug addicts, we have to ask ourselves, we can blame ourselves. You say, well, that's his fault. He's the one that's doing the drugs. I didn't tell him to do it. But we have to be more understanding that the root cause of all of this is the same folk who put us on the ships and brought us over here. I was in Senegal. I was in Ghana, and I saw the holes that slaves went through when they got on the slave ships. I saw that with my own eyes. And from the time that I realized from the time that we left the shores of Africa till we got here, and until this day, the problem is still there because the race problem still exists. And it exists in your neighborhood, in your communities. We're not poor because we want to be. And nobody's no fool. I mean, everybody wants to eat, and you want to sleep. You want a job, and when you don't, and when in the city of Chicago, 47% of the young folk now are unemployed.
But aren't we still segregated though?
Absolutely.
Yes, I mean,
Chicago,
so-
by the way, is the most segregated system in the country
That's a point that I wanted to get
in terms
on.
of housing.
But that's one of our big problems. If we can come from up under that, we might can have some change. But if we stay segregated, then it's gonna stay the same.
Yeah, but we're not segregated because we don't want to. Look, Doc, if I could live out there in Highland Park,
Yeah.
I'd be out there tomorrow. In fact, show me the way. I'll go down Sheridan Road right now.
So,
I'm still living on the west side because I can't afford to live nowhere else.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But we gotta bring it to the people.
So, growing up and getting older, I started to realize that there is a sort of implied segregation in Chicago, especially with CPS schools. Because
Absolutely.
when I was little, I went to a predominantly black school. I ended up getting to a selective Roman high school where kids from all over the city came. And when they were talking about their experiences, there were some kids who came from Beverly. They experienced racism. And to me, it was really kind of like, it was confusing to me because a lot of people hide under the fact that segregation isn't legal. Just because it isn't legal doesn't mean that people are still going to do it.
Right.
Right.
And sometimes I found myself comparing the situation now to how it was back then. Of course, it's not as severe as it was back then,
But it's
but
still
the
there.
fact that it's here,
It's in there.
it's bad. So, what is some advice you can give to students who want to, stop that implied segregation in CPS school systems?
Well, I think that racism is always going to be here. I don't think it's going anywhere. There's too many different people in the world. I think, though, we have to look at its brothers and sisters. Classism, sexism, and ageism. They're just as deadly. You don't know what they look like. And sometimes if you're in a situation, it's easier to identify white, or somebody different than you than saying, wait a minute, does this have something to do with my age? Or does this have something to do with my class that I come from the west side of Chicago? I mean, because that's been my journey. I have been defined all of my life. And not by people who are different than me, but people who are just like me.
Let me ask you, I was a student organizer. Before I ever, I told you I started in the NAACP at 15. By the time I was 17, I was in Nashville, Tennessee, and I was organizing the student movement there. What you can do, that's the question that you asked. Number one, you got to get involved. If you see wrong, don't run the other way. As a student organizer, whenever I felt that something was wrong or something was illegal, or if I felt that my rights were being denied, the first thing that I did, I didn't ask nobody to help me. I took it upon myself to get involved in it. And then the second thing you do as an organizer, if you feel it that strong, then you organize other students. Just like you sitting in the cafeteria, like gang boys in your cafeteria, they organize around gangs right there in the public school cafeteria. You should organize around your complaints and your grievances as to why the school system is not serving you and giving you what the students in Naperville High School have.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at if you look at the Sabo School, right here in Chicago, if you look at some of the major black schools, they're closing down. All the major schools in Inglewood, they just announced that today.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at what you're getting over here on the south and the west side, and what white students are getting out in the suburbs, something wrong with that picture. So what are you going to do about it? I have to organize it. I have to teach my fellow students, right, that something's wrong with this picture. If Naperville has the best science technology, and they have all of the computers, and they get everything that they need to make them productive citizens later in life, why don't I have it on the south side of Chicago? If you sit back and do nothing and don't organize and talk to other students and mobilize them, then you're like sitting there, it's like getting slapped upside of the head and said, I don't like to get hit, but you ain't hitting nobody back.
I mean, it's
Now-
always good.
Oh, go on.
it's always good, just like Attorney Myers said, speak up, speak out. Just like Dr. King had a dream, you can have a dream too. It's always important to speak up and speak out.
And pursuing human rights is a lifetime commitment. There's certain things there that are lifetime commitments. Your family, your children. Pursuing human rights is a lifetime commitment. It doesn't stop because you finish college and you become whatever professional you become. You are still always, because as a race of people, we will always be pursuing how to rise up out of this demon of hatred.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
So you'll be doing this for the rest of your life. You won't just be become educated in school. You will continue to educate yourself by, as Attorney Myers said, getting involved, coming up with some of your own ideas, implementing some of your own programs, and doing some of the things that you think need to be done to help other people. Mm-hmm. Okay? So we all have our professions, we all have our jobs, we all have our obligations, but we still have to each one teach one. We got each, if you don't help but one person understand what the struggle is all about.
In
Learn
Washington,
to duck.
You see, it says there's a statute that says freedom is not free. It is not free.
So, why do you think Dr. Martin Luther King took a nonviolence approach?
I didn't hear the question. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say that I've always believed tactically that the urge to violence was the way that they were going to defeat the movement. If you respond with violence, not only do you get off of your track, but you open yourself up to other violations. You don't have to deal with that. That's not what you're there for. If you're there for a purpose, you want to focus on the purpose. And while lashing out may seem good, if it distracts you from the purpose, all of a sudden now your actions become the reason that you don't get to finish because you lashed out. It may be bitter and painful to take a blow, to take harm, but within the search for your own, what you believe justice is, it may be something that you encounter to stay on the path. Don't be distracted from your path, because that's how everybody gets off of it. The need for violence.
As goes the saying, keep your eye on the prize.
Right,
Stay humble.
right.
And his philosophy was that if I'm strong enough to take the lick, then I'm stronger than you. And that's from his, and he's done a lot of writing on that, on the nonviolent movement. In the letter from the Birmingham jail, he explains that too.
Yeah, and I think, I don't want to be hypocritical with young folk, old folk either. Let me tell you something. And I've had a chance to travel through Africa. I started out carrying in Havana, Cuba. 1975 I was there. I was in Africa in 1976, and I've gone back and forth for a number of years. The African continent would not be free today in a nonviolent movement. Didn't happen. So with Dr. King, and I love him and admire him, nonviolence was the proper tactic in the proper time when it happened. Once I left the shores of the United States and really began to travel in the world, from South Africa all the way to Angola. I was in Angola during the war in 1988 when they were fighting in Southern Africa. I was there. So let me say something to you. Nonviolence is a philosophy, but at the end of the day, there are those of us who realize that Hitler would not have been defeated nonviolently. That sometimes in the world you have to draw the line and you have to fight. That does not undercut what Dr. King said. But on December 4th, this coming Monday, is the death of Fred Hampton. Let me say this. Fred Hampton was a member of the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther, I happen to have been in 1975 in Cuba with Huey Newton. He was in exile there when I was there. We used to be together every night. I was in Havana. Let me tell you something. Sometimes self-defense is as important as no defense. And the dignity of a human being is based on how much you will allow your enemy to abuse you. And sometimes your enemy is not going to kiss you. You're going to have to fight. And damn it, if the fight is the fight, and if that's what's going to free you, then bring it on.
All right.
So I don't want you to grow up in a world thinking that you have to what? Be slapped around. I was a part of the nonviolent movement, and it was right. I got slapped around. And I did kneel and I did bend. It was at that time, at that place, when I grew older and understood what made the world tick, then my view on what it was going to take to free me and free my people was totally different.
I guess I'm such a proponent of nonviolence because I taught in Chicago, and the pain to listen to a third grader who has to struggle with whether or not if his brother think that they should go toward the problem, because you can't be scared. And I have to tell him, baby, fear means there's something wrong. You turn around and run. Third grade. I mean, the violence that we're looking at now, something happened where we obviously did not learn, the concept, yes, I understand exactly where there's dignity in self-defense, but when it turns on you, when you are your own enemy, we're personally, I mean, this pipeline from schools to jail, I mean, it's wrecked my life. It's a part of, we have those missions in our lives, those things that hurt us forever, just dealing with what's going on with children. No, if we learn nonviolence, it would make a difference to our children, because it's not us anymore. It's really about the future. It's eschatology. It's the future, and how are they gonna survive? Because whatever you teach a child, that's what that child knows.
And strategy, the right actions at the right time. You can't do one thing all the time. You can while it works, but when it stops working, you have to change.
I think, Karen, maybe we should explain that so we won't get confused. The violence that we see in our neighborhoods, us killing each other, us robbing each other, us abusing each other, that is wrong. And the mind that turns internally and does that, that's a problem. And that problem has to be addressed because it's a sickness. It's something that the Center for Disease Control should be studying. What is it that makes you kill your brother?
Yes.
What is it that makes you kill your sister before you kill your real enemy? What is it? Now, let me tell you something. We have to address the problem of internal violence. I recommend to the students, this book is kind of heavy. A guy by the name of Frantz Fanon, Fanon, wrote a book called The Wretched of the Earth. He also wrote a book called Black Skin, White Mask. Part of and he was a black psychiatrist, he was from Martinique. Part of what he talks about in the book is why slaves, or why the oppressed were hurting each other more than they were hurting the people who were hurting them. And at the end of the day, in order to understand this problem, we have to get into the minds of why is it that the vice lords are fighting against the disciples, but they ain't fighting nobody in the banks downtown that controls the money, that controls the jobs, that controls your day-to-day life. So, problem is much broader. Maybe I'm being a little academic, yeah.
Please do.
I feel like one thing that influences young people to come after each other and try to kill each other is the mindset that they can't trust anyone. Like, I notice a lot of times when I talk to my peers that are like related to gang life, they always say, oh, I can't trust anybody. And I feel like if you live under the mindset that you can't trust anybody, you're going to come after anyone. And if you're surrounded by people who look like you and you don't think you can trust them, you're going to come for them. And, you know, kill or be killed. That's how I feel like people think. And I feel like it's like that because a lot of us, we live in poverty. We value materialistic things. We value certain things. But I think that people need to get that out of black people's mindsets, that we have to value materialistic things. Because once we keep valuing things like that, it's gonna make us go crazy. That's why I feel like.
And there's no love in the homes. No love at all.
There are two economies. There's the economy of God and the economy of man. And what you just shared is that the economy of man is less than the economy of God, because man himself is the economy of God. That's more important, you know, the love in the homes, the things we really knew. And if you were born a couple of generations removed from the things we knew, how are you supposed to know, you know? So as you said, you know, we have to look at those two economies and see, you know, wait a minute, is this really important? You know, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, all of this still goes back to, at the end of the day, education. And I'm not just talking about going to Chicago public schools. Public schools and poverty and all that were the same all over this country. St. Louis, Detroit, Philadelphia, New York, D.C., everywhere. Young people think that it's something different today. It is not. It does go to parenting. It does go to educating yourself and sharing that and developing institutions and using the institutions that we have in our own communities to help each other. We have got to do that.
Well, we're letting social media teach us.
That's right.
We let social media teach us. And if they take that away and go back to the books.
And I ask, is that by design or by accident?
Might be both. It might be both.
No, it's by design. Ain't no accident.
Correct.
He's giving me, my man is giving me the high five. That means 5 more minutes left. Let me just say this. We're taught to hate. You know what? We're taught to hate each other because somebody ain't doing enough to teach us how to love.
That's right.
If I walked up to my brother, instead of saying, you know good, you know whatever, and we had an argument, and I turned and said, brother, I love you, that could disarm a lot of people if we are taught, and the images, which is the theme of this program, shaping what? Young minds. You're taught to hate because we're not being taught to love. We're taught to disrespect because we don't really understand what respect is. We're taught to be less than men because no men step up and train men as to what they ought to be doing. Same with women. We have a lot of work to do. I appreciate being on the panel. I gotta go.
Well, can I say this real quick? There is a restorative justice cultural competency movement coming into our public schools.
Right.
And just look out for it, because that means we're building from the bottom up.
Right.
Answer yourself one question to begin. What do you love? And
That's
make
right.
the answer to that first question yourself. If you can love you, you can love someone else.
Yes, you can.
If you can't love you, you will find it very difficult to love someone else. So just stop with you. Ask yourself what do I love, and make sure the first answer is you. From there, once you've got love, you can give it.
If you got it in, you can bring it out.
We've come to the end of our show. Next month is Black History. Please tune us in February. This has been Shaping Young Minds, and you can for more information, you can contact us at symtvshow@gmail.com. Thank you. I'm Michael Brown.
Yeah, all right. See you later.